Good evening, everyone. My name is Jeffrey Nichols. I'm the CEO of the National Civil War Museum in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and I want to welcome all of you to tonight's civil conversation featuring Dr. Bruce Levine, talking about his book, Thaddeus Stevens, Civil War Revolutionary Fighter for Racial Justice. Before we get into our conversation, just a few pieces of housekeeping. We want to, of course, thank our sponsor for tonight, Visit Hershey Harrisburg. They support this program and, frankly, all of our programs at the museum. And the reason this is free is because of their generosity. So thank you to them. If you want to learn more about the National Civil War Museum, please visit our website at nationalcivilwarmuseum.org. You can also see a list of upcoming lectures and programs. And there's also a link on our site that brings you to the Visit Hershey Harrisburg site if you're coming from out of town and you're looking for other things to do. Those are two great places to learn about the community. Our next program in this series, our online series, it will be on May 2nd at 7 p.m. With a professor named Dr. Robert Colby and a book called Unholy Traffic, Slave Trading in the Civil War South. You can learn more about that, again, on our website. And with that, I will introduce Dr. Levine. He is a best-selling author of 4 books on the Civil War era, including The Fall of the House of Dixie and Confederate Emancipation, which received the Peter Seaborg Award for Civil War Scholarship and was named one of the top 10 works of nonfiction, best works of nonfiction by the Washington Post. He's Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Illinois, and from our conversation, very happily so. So, Dr. Levine, welcome.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks for having me. Please call me Bruce.
I will. Thank you. And it's a pleasure. Thank you again for joining us today about this conversation about the Great Commoner. Someone who's a bit near and dear to me as I've studied the Civil War over the last few years. So just to begin the conversation, again, from a very high level, who was Thaddeus Stevens and why did you choose to write about him?
Well, Thaddeus Stevens was probably the most important figure in the United States Congress, and certainly one of the most important people in the American Union during the course of the Civil War. Someone who had also played a key role prior to the Civil War in struggling against slavery. During the Civil War, played an even more central role in pushing the Union toward an anti-slavery strategy in the course of seeking to suppress the withdrawal from the Union. And after the Civil War, was in the forefront of those trying to create a genuinely multiracial democracy in the United States. And those seem to me more than enough reason to write about this figure.
Yeah, absolutely. So we begin at the beginning with him. Can you tell us a bit about where he's from, his childhood, and what his childhood was like?
Well, this was a man whose family had come the end of the 18th century to Vermont from Massachusetts. His family was poor and in search of better land than was available, at least in their price range in Massachusetts. They joined many others from that state in moving into recently developed Vermont. And what they found in Vermont was that there were conflicting claims to that piece of land. New Hampshire claimed it. New York State claimed it. New Hampshire gave pretty much unencumbered rights to that land, but New York State, which was dominated, the colony of New York, which was dominated politically by great landlords, particularly in the great river valleys, laid claim to the same land and attempted to challenge the grants made by New Hampshire. And so there was a major, lengthy armed struggle in that piece of territory that eventually gave birth to the independent state of Vermont, as the farmers from New England successfully struggled to obtain land free from rent and free from domination by the semi-feudal landlords. And that fact left a deep mark in the politics and the consciousness of the people of Vermont, and made it probably one of the most politically progressive states of what would eventually become the United States. It was one of the most transparently democratic state governments, one of the, indeed, the only state constitution in the United States at that time that specifically denounced human slavery. No other state did that. The British Empire didn't do that for decades later. And this political culture, this democratic, anti-slavery political culture, I think was important in shaping the political consciousness of this young man in his first 20 or so years of life.
And you mentioned the great landlords from New York who had owned lands, and obviously that would also become a key component of his political thought as leading up to the Civil War. And of course, the so-called landlords weren't in New York, but were in the South.
Indeed.
The Confederate elite, as I think he is mentioned once in your book. You mentioned obviously that he grows up in this community, in a state that is anti-slavery, but he also is really, from reading your book, influenced by, and his family, by the Declaration of Independence.
Yes,
that's another piece of his childhood that I think his parents brought to him, or his mother in particular. But please talk about that and how that also impacted his life.
Well, the Declaration of Independence was probably the most politically radical document of its era, and certainly the most politically radical document of the foundation of the United States of America. This, of course, is the document that insists that all men are created equal. And Stevens later recalls, as an adult, he recalls that he was raised to deeply respect that document, and particularly that doctrine of human equality. And that was not true of all of the founders. When it came time, for example, to write the Constitution, a number of those we think of as the founding fathers did as much as they could to limit the political power of common people. That was not the code of values with which Thaddeus Stevens was raised. He, on the contrary, strongly believed in political democracy, and so did his neighbors.
And that's exactly, I think, the point that comes clearly across in your book. And he's also impacted very thoroughly and through his life by his religious faith. He was raised a Baptist. Is that correct?
That's right. And this is a religion that traces its heritage back to the revolution against the British monarchy in the 16th century. And it's a religion which thereafter puts a big emphasis on individual rights and individual responsibilities, and that encourages members of the congregations to challenge what they hear from the pulpit. So once again, it's a very democratically inspired branch of Protestantism. And Stephen's mother was a deeply pious woman, and made sure that Stevens was raised keenly aware of and participating in that religious culture. So here's another source of Stevens' democratic ideals and his belief in the value of the free individual. And for that matter, the ritual that gives its name to this branch of Protestantism, baptism, the Baptists insisted that people be baptized, be brought fully into the fold not automatically as children, but only as adults once they have consciously embraced the values and doctrines of the religion, because they took so seriously the idea of individual choice and individual participation and conscious participation in the ongoing affairs of the church.
And just as a quick reminder for those that are on the call, if you have a question or a comment you'd like to make, please use the chat feature. We'll keep an eye on that and refer to them from time to time, or get to them at the end of the conversation. You mentioned, Bruce, briefly his mother. She really worked very hard to ensure that he had a proper education, and I think you write about her working at night. Can you talk a little bit about that and the role his parents played in his life?
Well, his father disappeared from the family in around 1804, and we're not exactly sure what happened there, but we are sure that it placed a great burden on Stephen's mother and made her an even more important figure in his youth than she would otherwise have been. She also understood that he, like one of his brothers, had a physical disability that would have prevented him from pursuing a whole range of occupations as an adult. And so partly for that reason, she determined that he had to eventually enter one of the professions. And she went way out of her way to make sure that he had as good an education as someone with his family's limited means could obtain. She taught him to read. She taught him to love reading in his teens, because he was living in a part of the world where there were not many books available. He tried to create and set out to create a community library in his part of the world. Excuse me. And he always credited his mother in later years with this really crucial role in launching him upon his way.
So he gets launched upon his way. I believe he attends Dartmouth. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then when he's obviously born or raised in Vermont, but then he makes his way here to Pennsylvania. Can you talk about how he ended up here and what was the first few years of his life here like?
Sure. Before I do, though, let me just say a word or two about his college experiences. When he was at Dartmouth, we know what books basically students in his position read. And so I made a point of going back and reading those books again, sometimes for the first time, to have a better sense of what ideas this young man was exposed to. And they were the ideas of the Enlightenment. Mm-hmm. These were the ideas that, again, emphasize the importance of individual human reason and sought to reconcile Christianity with a respect for human reason, so that these ideas were not simply to be accepted on faith, but to be argued for and understood in a rational way. Excuse me. And he was taught by faculty members who were themselves bathed in and educated in the same sets of ideas. Some of those books also, by the way, criticized human slavery. Mm-hmm. But it was difficult to find work where he had gone to school. And a friend of his found work successfully in Pennsylvania. And it seems that this is what led Stevens to Pennsylvania in search of greater economic opportunity, which is indeed what he found there.
It was, and he ends up in Gettysburg,
right,
pre-war, obviously, and becomes an attorney as well. And around this time, gets involved in politics, and this is where he really begins to join different parties. He went through a series of political party attachments through his life. I think it was just partially a volatile time in American politics. But can you talk a little bit about how he became engaged in politics and leading up to his first political office?
Yeah, he starts off in a series of local and municipal offices. When he graduated college, he was apparently one of a handful of students who were invited to give a speech upon graduation. And one of the things he criticizes is what he calls partisan spirit, by which he meant loyalty to a political party. But political parties, by the time he gets out of college and begins seeking a political career, are already fixtures in American political life. And so there was no percentage in clinging to that anti-partisanship. So he then joins a political party, which many historians looking back upon think of as being rather bizarre, the anti-Mason Party.
I had that thought myself.
Yes, and in fact, a modern person looking at this, seeing a political party that is dedicated above all at opposing this voluntary fraternal organization, excuse me, the Masons, could be forgiven for also thinking it was a crank outfit.
Mm-hmm.
But we need to understand that at the time, the Masons were a very influential association of well-to-do individuals. Membership was secret, and by secret oaths, the members of this association bound themselves to one another and to supporting one another over others in both economic and political life. And so to many people who learned of its existence, this seemed a danger to the Republic. Here was a coterie of people who secretly were allied with one another to the disadvantage of others. It seemed to be an exclusionary cabal, if you will. And so a number of individuals of serious stature in American history opposed it, and Thaddeus Stevens opposed it as an undemocratic, dangerous organization. And so it did not seem like a crank outfit at the time. Incidentally, one newspaper editor who criticized them was apparently murdered in this period and disappeared.
Criticized the Masons.
Yeah, evidently so.
Okay.
And so this, of course, created quite an hysteria against the Masons and strengthened the anti-Mason movement. And so Stevens really begins his career in Pennsylvania in that political party. In terms, however, of long-term perspectives, the anti-Masons were so successful in minimizing the power of the Masons and forcing them to retreat that basically the point became moot. There was no longer a point to imposing the Masons. And so basically the ground slipped out from under him in partisan terms, and it was time to look for another political party. I said the ground slipped out from under him, but in some way his partisan life looks like someone jumping from one ice floe to another over the course of time as they either disappear, as those ice floes either disappear or prove somehow incapable of getting him where he needs to go. So the next party he joins is the Whig Party. And what the Whig Party stands for is basically the development of what we would call free labor capitalism, or at least capitalism. Government assistance to the development of manufactures, transportation, and communication, and commerce. And Stevens, by now, had become a strong believer in the importance to human progress of the development of the capitalist economy. he was convinced that this was the source. The economic development was the necessary underpinning of all other aspects of human progress, political, cultural, moral, and so on. And he found such a party, once again, in the Whigs. And he remained there and became a power there for some time.
Um, and then he still has more moves to make after the Whig Party. We'll talk about that in a minute or two. But getting back to his early life, he's elected to the state house in Pennsylvania, and he becomes, in I think it's 1834, in a movement for public education, make it a
Right.
universal need. And obviously, I think this fits in directly with his childhood and with his philosophy on life. And can you talk a little bit about his role in that and what the outcome was, and then get into also after he leaves the state house, he's appointed again or elected to the state constitutional convention in 1837, and just talk a little bit about his experience there.
Okay, let's start with education. We today take for granted, I guess, the availability of universal free education, at least in the first 12 years of a child's life. That was unusual, very unusual at the time in the United States. The states of New England had that as part of the Puritan influence, but Pennsylvania did not. And Stevens was one of the foremost fighters for the creation of a system of education that was free of charge for all children in the state. And he manages, and he and his allies, I should say, manage to get that passed. But then there is a storm of protest against that because large numbers of people in the state did not believe that they should pay taxes in order to educate the children of other people. If I have no child in school, why in the world should I be paying to educate others? Let that family bear the burden of educating their child. Stevens had a much more expansive view of the role of government, that government needed to do what was necessary to make their society function in the way that it should function. And he chastised people with what he regarded as a narrow-minded and selfish attitude toward their neighbors. He chastised them for not understanding that they needed other people to be educated if their property was to be secure. If the money that they were so afraid of spending for the sake of others was to be secure, they needed a citizenry that understood everything that a citizenry needed to understand in order to participate successfully and fairly in government. Excuse me. Seem to have swallowed a frog this evening. And I beg your pardon?
I said these things happen.
And so Stevens fought against the tide of opinion. And many of his colleagues folded on this subject. Stevens refused to fold. And this is a harbinger of much of what would come later in his life. Stevens refused to back down, even if it was going to cost him his seat in the legislature. And he fought back, and he gave so stirring and powerful a speech in the legislature in defense of the recently created school system that those colleagues who had just folded up unfolded and reinstated the school system that they had created. And that was the birth of Pennsylvania's free educational system.
And so he obviously takes this very hands-on role in the political debate very early in his political career. But for all his hard work to get this passed, he ends up losing his next election, I believe.
That's
And
right.
and based upon really his advocacy for the education program. But then he is elected again to the Pennsylvania State Constitutional Convention
Right.
to rework the state constitution for the first time since I think 1794-ish. Can you talk a little bit about that and what he was advocating there?
Yeah, there were two, if I remember correctly, there were two major issues that in which he played a central role. One was, once again, the question of education arises. And once again, Stevens has to make the case at the convention that he had just made in the state legislature, and that, as you say, had cost him his seat. Because no matter what he said, no matter how golden his phraseology, a lot of his constituents still didn't want to pay for their neighbor's education. But one a testimony to the fact that how unshaken Stevens could be in his convictions and in his values, he gets to this convention and the subject comes up again, and there he is in the front ranks, still arguing in favor of free education for all. His opponents saying, no, let's only have free education for those who are certified as paupers. And Stevens objects to that. He said, why do you want to divide the citizenry into the well-to-do and the paupers and shame the people who are so designated, who are designated as paupers? Make this instead free for all. And the second, and he succeeds in that too. The second issue has to do with race. The original state constitution had been vague about who had the right to cast a ballot in the state of Pennsylvania. Some places prevented African Americans from voting. Other places permitted them to vote. At the time Stevens was elected to the convention, there was an upswell of racist sentiment across the North. And many Pennsylvanians were demanding that the Constitution be amended to make it 100% clear that only white men could vote. And Lincoln denounced this argument, championed the right of African American men to vote. And when his colleagues instead barred African American men from voting more explicitly than ever before, Thaddeus Stevens and a handful of others refused to sign the new document, refused to sign the amended version of the Constitution. This was an extremely unusual political position in the North, not only to oppose slavery, but also to insist on equal rights, including voting rights for African Americans. Only the tiniest fraction of white people in the United States held that view. Thaddeus Stevens was a vociferous member of that tiny fraction.
And I've read that, and I thought the same thing that you mentioned, that this was a very unpopular position to take for a politician, and also one that had few allies, at least in of his peers. And I think it again shows his leadership and his determination, and all this growing out of his childhood and his education. It sort of begins to make a lot of sense as you study this and look at his story. And you talk about his views on slavery, and what was his view on abolition at the time as well? What overall in the more or less the 1830s, what was his perspective? What was he against?
If you look at him, simply this individual and what he believed in, he was an abolitionist. He opposed slavery, wanted to see slavery brought to an end as soon as possible. And furthermore, as I said a moment ago, believed in equal rights for African Americans. And even though anti-slavery, which is a broader category than abolitionism, even though opposition to slavery was more or less broad in the North. After all, by this time, all northern states had outlawed slavery within their own borders. But a belief in the political equality of former slaves was extremely unusual. But and only the abolitionists, which, as I say one more time, were a very, very small minority in the North, only they espoused that point of view. Stevens did. Stevens, at various points, says that he thinks that the abolitionists have done or said things that were too extreme, but it's never clear and it's never specific what he has in mind. And whenever push comes to shove, Thaddeus Stevens is shoulder to shoulder with the rest of the abolitionist movement.
And so as the 1830s move into the 1840s, he's successful in several fields, one being he's a successful attorney, and now he's getting engaged in politics. And it's inevitable that, particularly as you go through enter the war years, to really look at his perspective on slavery against what Abraham Lincoln was thinking at the same time.
Right.
You do write about this as well. So could you talk a little bit about these men who did not know each other, I think, at that point in any way, but what their contrast and their views were at the time? Were there any similarities on the issue of slavery?
Well, there are certainly there are similarities, and indeed, at a certain point, these two men correspond with one another. They both belong to the Whig Party. They both serve in the state legislature as Whigs in their respective state legislatures. Stevens, of course, in Pennsylvania, and Lincoln in Illinois. So they're colleagues, and they also agree that slavery is wrong. And there's no doubt that Abraham Lincoln thinks slavery is wrong, as he will eventually say, if slavery is wrong, if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. Right. And obviously that's a sentiment with which Thaddeus Stevens hardly agrees. But on every question on which this issue bears, Stevens is in a more advanced position than Lincoln. So a Southern governor demands at one point that the states of the North make it a crime to speak and organize in their own states against slavery. Thaddeus Stevens takes a stronger position than Lincoln does in opposing that. In the 1840s, the United States goes to war with Mexico, starting in 1846, in order to tear off a piece of that country, a big piece. Basically, 50% of Mexico is taken away in the Mexican-American War and added to the United States. And the question then arises, what's going to be the status of slavery in all of this land? Northerners generally think it should be outlawed in those not yet states, but what were then called territories. And Lincoln thought so too. And the South wanted slavery to be automatically legal in all of those states. And so there's a major confrontation in the country and in the Congress over this issue. And it reaches a stalemate. And a compromise is whipped up by the leaders of the Democratic and the Whig parties, according to which California will come into the Union as probably a free state. It will be left up to the people of California to come in, and they will come in as a state. As for the other territories, the rest of the land taken from Mexico, that will be decided by white residents of those territories. It's a doctrine called popular sovereignty. And to make this deal a little sweeter to the North, rather to the South, a fugitive slave law is added to the package, which made it easier for those of the Southern elite who claimed that their slaves had fled into the free states to pursue those slaves and pull them back into slavery. And by the way, requiring those masters to produce very little evidence that the individuals they were claiming, in fact, were slaves, and making it obligatory upon Northerners, whatever they thought about slavery, to join the posse pursuing the alleged fugitives. Lincoln endorsed that compromise. Thaddeus Stevens refused to support that compromise. And in the process, he alienates much of the Whig Party in Pennsylvania, and especially in his county, as a result of which he loses his seat in the United States Congress. The Whig Party refuses to renominate him.
And his first speech on the House floor was denouncing slavery related to this bill, correct? And it was a rather fiery speech as well. And so you're right. All these things come together, and
it's not an individual who liked to pull his punches.
No, he wasn't. He did speak his mind. That is for sure. Was he deeply engaged in any of the negotiations during what became known as the Compromise 1850? Was he engaged in those?
No, he apparently was not. But I should say, by the way, before we pass on from this period of his life, that while all this was going on, Thaddeus Stevens was an active in the Underground Railroad.
Yes, that was my
the archaeological work done on his home and office and property in Lancaster has dug up a section of the building that was evidently used to hide fugitives on their way to Canada. And there's testimony from one of those fugitives that he was specifically directed to Stevens' home to seek assistance on his way north. And Stevens was part of a network of people who kept fugitives in the North aware of the location of slave hunters who were pursuing fugitives from the South and assisting them to evade those slave hunters. And so it wasn't just words, it was actions as well.
Yeah, and once again, he was a minority. A very small group of people were abolitionists in this country pre-war. And so he also put his, apparently, action where his rhetoric was as well.
That's right. And the Underground Railroad is one of those interesting things that everybody and his aunt claims to have been part of after the fact. Yeah. Everybody claims that their home was a station in the Underground Railroad. Everybody claims to have themselves or a member of their family to have participated in it. In fact, it was a very small, unofficial organization of people, and it took a lot of courage because it becomes illegal according to the fugitive slave law. It becomes illegal to obstruct the capture of fugitives. And Stevens gets involved in a case like that too. A handful of slaves managed to escape from their owner in Maryland in the early 1850s, I believe. And they wind up in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, where Stevens lives. And the man who had owned them back in Maryland puts together a posse, finds a United States Marshal, goes into Lancaster County, finds the home in which the fugitives are holed up, and demands that they surrender themselves. And of course, he and his posse are armed. And shots are exchanged between the fugitives and others in that house, and this posse and the slave owner is killed. And in the meantime, a whole host of neighbors have come up to observe or participate in this melee. The state, with the support of the federal government, brings very, very serious charges against a whole number of people who are accused of the murder of this slave owner and treason against the United States for having resisted the recapture of these slaves. Thaddeus Stevens is the nominal head of the defense team. And he and his colleagues win the case. And the attempt to punish these fugitives and their neighbors fails. And this infuriates the governor and the legislature of Maryland and the legislatures of other nearby slave states. And it also infuriates that section of the Whig Party in Lancaster County that sought to maintain good relations with the slave states and with fellow Whigs who lived in the slave states. And that contributes to the end of Stevens' membership in the Whig Party.
And that's coming right up to my next question. And when and how does he join this new party called the Republicans?
In the middle of the 1850s, the Republican Party is formed. It starts in Michigan and one or two other states and begins to spread. Thaddeus Stevens is one of the individuals in Pennsylvania that form a state-level branch of this party and campaign for its candidates. And he, in fact, heads up the presidential campaign of the first Republican candidate for the presidency, John C. Fremont. He heads up the state-level campaign for Fremont's attempted election in 1856. Fremont, of course, is not elected. A Democrat is elected instead, James Buchanan. But Fremont does very well, far better than any anti-slavery figure has done in politics in the North ever before. A majority of northern states wind up in his column, and a plurality of northern voters, not an outright majority, but the mid 40% of northern voters cast their ballot for the Republican candidate in 1856. So this is a sea change politically in the United States. Now, here is a party dedicated first and foremost to preventing the further spread of slavery, because slavery is spreading, as the Mexican War and its aftermath demonstrated. And so this is the first party that has taken a central stand against slavery, a sizable party, and that has done anything like as well as the Republicans have done.
And so this sort of leads us up to the beginning of the Civil War. And at this point, Stevens is not a young man. He's 69 when the war breaks out. He is a Republican serving in the House. He, unlike a lot of other people from reading your book, did believe that it was going to be a long struggle, that it wasn't going to be a 90-day war. And he also believed that slavery would need to be defeated to win it. So
Correct.
he understood
Absolutely.
from the very beginning what the central cause is. And by just our conversation, all of these agreements that we've spoken about and these issues, it always comes down to human bondage, slavery in the South, the economic, political, whatever the ramifications may be. And he also becomes the other thing that I think was interesting in your book, you also mentioned that it would need a revolution in the Southern way of life. And I think this we will continue to talk about a little bit, but this also plays into the venom that a lot of the Southern legislators had before the war and certainly after. So in early 1861, he becomes the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee. He becomes a very powerful figure. Can you talk about his role early in the war?
Yeah.
And what he was doing?
Sure. And of course, as I think probably everybody here knows, the Republican Party's second presidential candidate, Abraham Lincoln, is elected president in 1860 and does what Fremont was unable to do 4 years earlier. And that is the event that precipitates the attempt to break up the Union on the part of the slave-owning states. And without going into this at length, that's the cause of the Civil War. The fact that an anti-slavery party has elected its man and placed him in the White House. Lincoln, again, believes slavery is morally, politically, culturally, economically wrong, wants simply to put the country back together again in hopes that once it is put back together again, by whatever means necessary, including war, the Republican Party can resume the work of peacefully, gradually, constitutionally, eventually doing away with slavery. Thaddeus Stevens doesn't agree. Thaddeus Stevens believes that the war itself must be the instrument of slavery's destruction now, not sometime in the future, not by compensating the slave owners, not eventually, but now. He believes that because he has always believed that slavery must be done away with as soon as possible. And he believes that now this is an opportunity to do that because the slave states, by leaving the Union, have pulled themselves out from under the protection of the Constitution, the protection of slavery that the Constitution offered. And he believed, furthermore, that slavery was the most important source of the Confederacy's strength. The slaves fed the soldiers. The slaves did the heavy labor of the armies. The slaves kept the economy going and kept society going during the war. If you wanted to defeat the society militarily, you must do away with their labor system. You must pull this system out from under them. And so he was demanding of Lincoln very early in the war that Lincoln change his policy and move more directly and quickly toward abolishing slavery throughout the Confederacy, which, of course, Lincoln does 2 years into the war in the Emancipation Proclamation. And in general, the pattern is always during the war, Stevens stakes out a position. It's initially regarded as the lunatic fringe. Eventually, the realities of the situation make it clear to larger and larger numbers that this is, in fact, the only way to win this war, the only way to hold the Union together. And Lincoln winds up doing what Stevens had called for earlier. And the Emancipation Proclamation is a good example of that.
And certainly there are others, as you were referring to. And
yes, for example, put the former slaves into the army.
Right.
Make them Union soldiers. Lincoln, for a long time, says, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to do that. The white soldiers of the North will not serve beside black soldiers on an equal basis. And then Lincoln is forced to see that, again, without that source of manpower, the war cannot be won. And so Lincoln changes his policy.
Which is the common theme with Lincoln, or the growth of his policies through the war, so that a politician can have a position and change their mind when new evidence or new circumstances come online, which certainly happened. And you mentioned the fact that the Emancipation Proclamation, part of that is to enable African Americans to serve in the U.S. military. But even after that, Lincoln was a little slow on the draw, for at least for a few months, and obviously people like Stevens and others were not. But even before that, there were cases where enslaved people were escaping from their bondage and going to Union forces, and the confiscation idea of
That's
these
right.
people. Can you talk a little bit about that and what Stevens thought about that? And I think that probably falls into the same category we're talking about, that he was ahead of Lincoln and others.
It does. And it's important. I'm glad you raised this. Thank you for doing so, because it's important to emphasize that while we're mostly talking about Stevens, the individual, he doesn't exist in a vacuum. There is the slave population that is playing a key role in changing Union policy. So, for example, slaves, at least some of them, manage to keep themselves very well informed about what's going on politically in the country. This is despite the fact that 95% of them cannot read and are barred from reading by law in the South. But those who can read, or those who hear whites discussing this, learn that this is a war over slavery, and that the President of the United States, especially as the whites of the South see it, is an opponent of slavery. And so they take whatever opportunity presents themselves to escape as the war begins and to seek out Union outposts and Union armies and offer their services as laborers. Some Union generals, and the Union officer corps was generally rather conservative politically, but some Union generals look at the situation and realize they're being offered a two-faced advantage. They're being offered the opportunity to take away the labor power of the enemy and add to the labor power of the Union Army, not as soldiers at this point mostly, but as people working in support of the Union Army, doing all the myriad things that an army needs in order to function. And one general in particular at Fort Monroe on the Virginia Peninsula finds himself confronting 3 slaves one day, offering themselves up as assistants to the Union Army. And this is not an abolitionist general, but this is a general able to see what I said a moment ago, that this offers a military advantage. And so he says, fine, I confiscate you the same way that an officer at war has the right and obligation to confiscate a horse, a musket, any other kind of property of the enemy if it will strengthen that officer's army. I confiscate you and make you our own. And the federal government seconds that decision, okays that decision. And that's the beginning of the dawning of a new policy on the part of the Union, and leads to the first Confiscation Act in the summer of 1861 that in general, that generalizes this policy. And a year later, there is a second Confiscation Act that is even bolder and more expansive than the first. And all of that lays the groundwork for the Emancipation Proclamation itself.
And as Derek, one of our participants, said, and that general was Benjamin Butler, of course,
That's right.
Monroe. And as you mentioned, there were others who were also doing this, and it would gain steam through the war. And from everything I've read and other presentations we've had, the enslaved people also made wonderful spies for the U.S. Army during the course of the war in many ways. So with all of that, and obviously the war progresses, very briefly, obviously, Stevens is not untouched by the war himself. His own part of his livelihood. In 1837, he opens an ironworks facility called Caledonia, and it's on the Chambersburg Pike between Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, and a little town called Gettysburg. And in 1863, Jubal Early, Confederate general, leads his troops to Caledonia Ironworks and destroys the place. And he does that because he knows who owns it. Can you talk briefly about that? And I think we'll get back to Jubal. He plays a interesting role, and I think it had a lot to do with the legacy and the memory that Americans have of someone like Thaddeus Stevens.
That's true. Jubal Early, as Jeff says, basically had his troops laid waste to the ironworks, and he knows very well whose ironworks they are. In fact, the foreman asks Early why he has done this, why he's made a point of destroying this particular enterprise. And we're not talking about some modern giant factory, by the way. We're talking about a rather modest building reflecting the state of the iron industry in general in the United States in that era. And Early, according to the foreman, says that I'm doing this precisely because the man who owns these works, and I'm paraphrasing, was such an enemy of the South, such an enemy of the Confederacy, had done more to cripple the Confederacy than anyone else in the United States government. And that's quite a testimony. And it reflects how widely had spread word of Thaddeus Stevens' role in driving forward the anti-slavery policy of the United States government.
And as I mentioned, Jubal will come back as part of the legacy and the lost cause narrative long after Thaddeus Stevens is gone. But as the war progresses and begins to wind up in a victory for the United States, obviously the 13th Amendment gets debated and passed. Can you talk about Stevens' role in that process as well?
Well, at the risk of being repetitious, Thaddeus Stevens is calling for an amendment to the Constitution to make firmer than the Emancipation Proclamation could do, because it's simply a proclamation, a wartime proclamation of a wartime president. Stevens says we've got to get this into the Constitution so no president can change his mind, no legislature can repeal the law. It's in the Constitution, ironclad in. We need to abolish slavery, and not simply in the states of the Confederacy. We need to abolish slavery throughout the United States. We need to make slavery as such illegal. And it's worthwhile pointing out that emancipating those who are now slaves and making slavery illegal are not the same thing. Because just because you have freed all these individuals, nothing stops necessarily state government from re-enslaving them afterward, or in bringing in slaves or enslaving others in the future. Stevens says we've got to make that illegal now and forevermore. Lincoln doesn't agree to that for another year, to the idea of the 13th Amendment. Stevens is one of the pioneers of that amendment too. In 1864, at the time of his renomination, Lincoln endorses the idea, and that's the beginning of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution.
And of course, after that passes and the war ends and Lincoln is assassinated, the war's over, and it becomes a discussion about Reconstruction. How can you rebuild the South, bring it back into the fold, make sure slavery and its legacy are long gone and wiped out? And there are lots of approaches that many people have for this. And of course, Thaddeus Stevens plays a key role in all of it, at least until his death in 1868. But Johnson, of course, is a different man than Abraham Lincoln. Johnson is from Tennessee. He was a slave owner himself. He was not, I think it's safe to say he wasn't an abolitionist, although, you know, he
certainly not.
Yeah, and certainly was not a fan of African Americans in general. So a very different person to treat with. And from things I've read in the past, is obviously two phases or multiple phases, but the first two of Reconstruction, there's the presidential phase and then there's the congressional phase. And you in your book, you mentioned that Johnson called it restoration. Can you kind of lay out a little bit of what Johnson's was of readmitting Southern states and how Stevens and the radical Republicans, as they were called, reacted to that?
Well, as you say, Andrew Johnson was a Southerner. He was loyal to the Union, which made him exceptional among Southern white politicians. Lincoln valued him for that reason. The Republican Party valued him for that reason, and they made him Lincoln's vice president for that reason, in hopes of broadening the appeal of the Republican Party, which in fact in 1864 temporarily rebranded itself as the Union Party. Nobody anticipated, of course, Lincoln would be killed and that this man would become president of the United States, although Thaddeus Stevens objected at the time to the Republicans nominating Johnson for the vice presidency, precisely because of his politics, which were pro-union, but not especially anti-slavery. He had come over to support the Emancipation Proclamation only on a pragmatic basis, but he was a thoroughgoing racist, despised African Americans, and never ceased holding to that point of view. What he wanted to do after the war was over was basically slap the country back together again with as few changes as possible. And what the Democratic Party did, and he basically, for all intents and purposes, crosses back over to the Democratic Party where his origins lay. Their slogan is the Union as it is, the Constitution as it was. No changes. No equal rights for African Americans. Yes, yes, yes. Slavery is over, but that's the limit. That's the limit of change. And they basically look forward to African Americans becoming a subordinate caste in the United States. Not really citizens, people who were residents of the United States, but without the rights of citizens. And the Southern elite goes further than that, since the African American population provided with the labor that forms the basis of their wealth. They raise the cotton, they raise the rice, they raise the tobacco. And basically do almost 90% of the rest of the labor that they need. They're determined not only to deprive these former slaves of equal rights, they're determined to compel them to continue laboring for next to nothing and without any right to object. And they pass a series of laws designed to do that. As soon as the war is over, they try to reconstitute their wartime state governments, and they pass what are called the Black Codes, which basically says, that's right, these people are no longer slaves, but they also don't have the rights of white people. And the slave or the former slave population resists, and the Republican Party resists, because they see this as an undercover way of restoring slavery and returning the South to a position of political dominance of the kind that it had enjoyed for many, many years prior. And so they are determined to transform the South into a free labor society and to give more rights to African Americans. And the pressure of having to struggle against this attempt to basically overturn the gains of the Civil War drive the Republican Party into a more and more and more radical support for equal rights for the African American population, including rather the conservative wing of the Republican Party finds itself pulled in that direction, because the alternative is to allow the Democratic Party to regain control of the federal government, which it had enjoyed for years, and basically undercut all the gains of the Civil War. And the process of driving the Republican Party further and further along the lines of equality is led by Thaddeus Stevens and a handful of other radical Republicans.
And their reaction to this restoration approach is to attempt to pass a series of laws. They passed the Civil Rights Bill in 1866 and others. And this is where they begin to run into President Johnson and his veto. He begins to veto a number of legislation and eventually lead to the first impeachment trial in the history of the country, but also leads to, I believe, what became the 14th Amendment.
That's
and
right.
that in many ways is his, I think, principal legacy to our way, well, the 13th and 14th. But certainly he was a driver behind that. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of the 14th Amendment to Thaddeus Stevens? I think you did a little bit already, but expand upon that. And then we'll get into the final chapter of his life, which was the impeachment of President Johnson.
Well, the 14th Amendment is a big amendment and has many clauses. One says, and there's a struggle within the Republican Party over just how complete the political rights of slaves ought to be, how those rights should be articulated. Thaddeus Stevens eventually comes to the conclusion that slaves must be given, or slave men, sorry, bad way to say it, African American men need to be given the right to vote, the same way white men have the right to vote, because otherwise the Southern states are going to be governed by basically the Confederate leadership. And they make that clear pretty early because they start sending Confederate leaders not only to the state legislature, they send a bunch of Confederate officials to Washington, to Congress, including the vice president of the Confederacy, Alexander Stevens. And in the Louisiana legislature, the old Confederate generals get elected to office and show up in their Confederate uniforms. And the danger is that this restored Southern Democratic Party will link up with the Northern Democratic Party, which was never strongly in support of the Union war effort, and again, take control and undo the gains of the Civil War. Conceivably, undoing the 13th Amendment, but certainly doing away with or preventing the passage of any other protections for African Americans, and undoing and undermining the economy of the North, which was another factor in the minds of the Republican Party. And so Stevens comes to believe in the necessity of giving the vote to the African American men throughout the country, which is a tricky position to argue because the North is still riddled with racism. Racism is not peculiar to the American South in this era. The North, by and large, certainly at the beginning of the Civil War, holds to a strongly racist view. They don't go to war for the sake of African Americans. They go to war to preserve the Union, and they wind up liberating African Americans only because, in most cases, only because they saw this as necessary to the preservation of the Union. It was the only way to win the war. So fighting for the right of African American men to have the vote, not only in the South, but everywhere, is a very radical position and endangers the Republican Party. And basically, Stevens' position is, I don't care. This is right. This is what has to be done, and we're going to do it. And the 14th Amendment eventually passes. It also makes it clear that anyone born in the United States is automatically a citizen of the United States and of the state in which he or she is born. And so you cannot relegate them to a second-class position in those states. And you'll remember not too long ago, a president of the United States opposed this idea of birthright citizenship and questioned whether it ought to remain on the grounds that immigrants were coming in and having children, and those children were, quote, unfortunately, given citizenship rights. But this is in the Constitution. It's in the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment also imposes political restrictions on those who had served in the leadership of the rebellion against the United States, something about which, of course, modern politics is concerned right now.
Sure. Yeah, it's amazing how relevant this amendment has always been and continues to be for our country. And the last, as the 14th Amendment is passed and he's moving through the last stage of his political life and his life, he's failing, he's getting older, but there's one more task at hand, and that is the impeachment of President Johnson. And can you talk a little bit about how that came to be and what his role was? And obviously he wasn't impeached or convicted. So can you talk about that process? And
Johnson's doing everything he can to obstruct the transformation of the South, to obstruct the congressional attempt to reconstruct the South, including removing a series of men who have been placed in control of the reconstructed South for the purpose of transforming them. Johnson, they're almost always Union officers under the terms of the Reconstruction Act, and Johnson keeps replacing those who are inclined toward the rights of the African Americans with those who are inclined to conciliate the Southern white elite. And basically, Stevens and his colleagues, and it's not a smooth process. Stevens and others have to argue pretty vociferously to get the House of Representatives to do this. But eventually, Johnson's conduct is so inflammatory, is so destructive, and is so obviously standing in the way of doing what must be done from their point of view, that they do indeed bring a bill of impeachment against Andrew Johnson. And the House of Representatives votes to impeach him. And Stevens is on the committee that draws up the articles of impeachment, and he's also on the team that will conduct the trial in the United States Senate. Now, there are two different interpretations then as now about what makes someone impeachable. A narrow interpretation says the president must violate some specific law in order to be impeached. The broader interpretation says the president must misuse his office in some way in order to be impeached. And that it doesn't require the violation of an individual law. It simply means not doing what the Constitution says the president must do, which is see to it that the laws are observed, that the laws are applied. And if a president doesn't do that, that says Stevens and other radical Republicans, he can be impeached. And that's the debate that surrounds the impeachment process. And so the House votes in favor of impeachment. They bring it into the Senate. There is a trial of Andrew Johnson. And the Republicans come within a whisker of removing him from office, except that a handful of the most conservative members of the Republican Party refuse to vote for impeachment. And so Johnson holds on to office. But he's chastised by the simple process, and he pulls in his horns a bit thereafter, and the Republicans have less trouble with him for the rest of his presidential term. Nonetheless, what's now beginning to occur in the South is the organized white racist reaction against Reconstruction, the formation of the Ku Klux Klan, a series of organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, and the beginning of white terror in the South, exercised against the former slave population. And at one point, Thaddeus Stevens says, in despair, my one regret in life is to have lived so long and to have accomplished so little.
Yeah, and actually that leads to obviously he passes in August of 1868. He's 76 or so. It's only the third man to lie in state in the Capitol building. But one of our questions from Guy Perdue actually talks about that. Is at the end of your book, Thaddeus Stevens appears to have been rather frustrated by the collapse of Reconstruction. Do you think he died an embittered man, or do you feel he'd done the best he could? I think that quote sort of speaks to it, but can you explore that a little bit more?
Well, he's frustrated not only by the fact that this armed reaction is occurring in the South, and he doesn't feel that the Republican government is doing enough to put it down, but Stevens also had one more iron in the fire. He believed that in order to make the South the kind of society that it should be, it was not enough to give African Americans the same political rights as white people. It was necessary to put some economic ground, no pun intended, under them. And
Right.
So Stevens had believed since his youth, after all, he comes from the state where farmers had fought for the rights to their land and understood land ownership as being central to citizenship. Stevens still believes that. And Stevens wants to take the land of the great slave-based manors, the slaves of the tiny but extremely wealthy Southern elite, the land that they owned, confiscate it and divide it into small farms and give those farms to the people whose families had been working that land for so many generations. And Stevens, you would have thought, would have succeeded in doing that, because by now he's got a lot of prestige in the Republican Party. After all, one thing after another that he had advocated during the war and that the Republican Party had initially basically dismissed as too radical, they had eventually come to accept as necessary. So one might have expected that on this issue too, the Republican Party would acquiesce. No, this was a bridge too far. They were finally persuaded by the threat to the Union to confiscate a form of property that the Northern Republicans didn't think was legitimate to begin with, property in human beings. But property in land, that was a horse of another color. That was something else entirely, especially in peacetime. And so the Republican Party rejects his efforts to confiscate and redivide the land, to enact what in the modern era we would call land reform in the South. And this too was a source of great frustration to Stevens, because it left not only threatened to leave political power in the hands of the old elite, it continued to leave all the great wealth of the South in those same hands. So Stevens was certainly frustrated. I think the words that I read off earlier about having lived so long and accomplished so little caught him at a nadir, at a low point emotionally. I don't think that probably is the way he looked back upon his whole life when things calmed down a bit. But still, he felt that the job was undone, was not yet completed, that this was a revolution as yet unfinished. And he feared that he saw the rollback of even what had been accomplished on the horizon.
And he was, of course, absolutely right. That's exactly what happened in many ways. And so as a final kind of thought, final question, what happened to his legacy after the war? And what do you see as his most enduring legacy today?
Well, the war era was the high point of Northern radicalism. It was the high point of the North's willingness to fight for doing away with slavery, and then even eventually for giving equal civil and political rights to African Americans. In the years following, the Northern population begins to consciously retreat from that high point, gets more and more conservative. The Republican Party becomes more and more the party of Northern business, and more preoccupied simply with getting the country back on its feet as they saw it, reestablishing peaceful, not only political, but economic relations between North and South. And that involved placating the Southern elite, and the Republican Party begins to do that, begins to retreat steadily and to back away from its earlier commitment to equality of rights. And by the 1890s, this takes the form of the Supreme Court basically saying that full-blown segregation and the subordination of African Americans is consistent with the Constitution, regardless of the 14th Amendment, regardless of the 13th Amendment, separate but equal, they say, in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, becomes the law of the land. And of course, separate is not equal. Separate is for the purpose of unequal, keeping Black people out of schools, public schools, for whites, keeping them out of a whole host of jobs, denying them access to a whole host of publicly owned facilities, has as its purpose the denial of equality to those people. But the Republican Party is in full retreat. And where the Republican Party goes, the whole of academia and cultural businesses in the United States follow. And so the South's version of the Civil War gets smuggled back into American culture. And so you see in novels, in public ceremonies, in movies, once those are being produced, like Birth of a Nation at the turn of the century, you see the apotheosis of the South. You see the South emerging as heroes. The Civil War was just a big mistake. Was just a tragedy on both sides, with good people on both sides of that struggle. And Thaddeus Stevens is vilified in novels and movies as a creature who stands in the way of of national unity. And it isn't until the 1960s that that begins to change. When John F. Kennedy publishes his his book, Profiles in Courage, for which he gets the Pulitzer Prize, he has a chapter in it that vilifies Thaddeus Stevens and that praises Andrew Johnson and praises the Republicans who refused to remove Johnson from office. And that isn't criticized until after the civil rights movement, retrospectively. In fact, it is said that John Kennedy eventually says, maybe what they taught me at Harvard and what I have put into this book actually isn't true. But there it was. And it's not until the 1970s and especially the 80s and the 90s that Stevens is beginning to get another look. And once, because of the civil rights movement in the United States of the 60s and 70s, that brings about a rethinking of all these subjects, and therefore a rethinking of what the Civil War was really about and who was on what side of history, that the champions of equality begin to be reevaluated in a more positive light.
Well, your book certainly does a wonderful job of telling the story of Thaddeus Stevens and in a clear and concise way. And I think it's appropriate to end our conversation today with some words from Thaddeus Stevens. In fact, what essentially his epitaph that he had inscribed on his tombstone, which you can still see today in Lancaster, and he had this inscribed on it. I repose in this quiet and secluded spot, not from any natural preference for solitude, but finding other cemeteries limited as to race by charter rules. I have chosen this that I might illustrate in my death the principles which I advocated for in a long life, equality of man before his creator. I don't think any of us could put it in better words than that. Bruce, thank you so much for spending the last hour and 20 minutes or so with us talking about your wonderful book. The book is available on our website, and I'm sure on other websites that you might be able to look at. But I really enjoyed this book and this conversation tonight. So thank you so much.
I enjoyed it too, Jeff, and thank you for having me.
Great. And thank you all for joining us. And we hope to see you all in early May for our next civil conversation. Have a good night, everyone. And thank you.